The Truss Paradox, Chapter 1, A New Dawn. The air in London crackled with an unfamiliar energy, a mixture of hope, skepticism, and fear. Massive screens adorned with the Union Jack commanded attention in public squares. This wasn't a royal wedding or a sports victory. It was something more divisive, a nationwide broadcast of Prime Minister Liz Truss announcing her Truss transformation. Evelyn Harris sat in her modest apartment, her fingers poised over her notebook. Her journalist instincts told her this was not just a policy announcement. It was the prelude to a seismic shift. Truss's presence on the screen was magnetic, her sharp words carrying the weight of bold ambition and dangerous conviction. The details of the transformation were both revolutionary and chilling. Corporate tax cuts, deregulation, and reduced public spending were touted as the keys to unleashing economic prosperity. Evelyn jotted down notes furiously, recognizing the makings of a historic moment. Her professional curiosity, however, was tinged with unease. The reporter in her saw the potential for chaos, the cracks hidden beneath the polished rhetoric. Outside, life in London carried on, though the city's rhythm seemed off-kilter. A taxi honked impatiently. Street vendors hawked their wares, but the crowd seemed distracted, their conversations turning repeatedly to the announcement. Evelyn felt the weight of the city's collective anxiety as she stepped onto her balcony, the autumn air biting against her skin. She flipped back through her notes, her mind assembling puzzle pieces from past stories and anonymous tips. Something about this transformation didn't add up. Its speed, its breadth, it felt orchestrated by forces beyond the corridors of Westminster. "This is just the beginning," Evelyn murmured to herself, her breath visible in the cold air. She resolved to dig deeper, knowing full well the risks that came with peeling back the layers of power. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Halls. Whitehall's hallowed corridors were steeped in an eerie quietness. Evelyn Harris walked through its labyrinthine passages, her press badge granting her access but not trust. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step echoing like the ticking of a clock counting down to some inevitable revelation. Whispers floated through the air, elusive as smoke. Civil servants murmured in hushed tones, their voices carrying just enough to suggest secrets worth hearing. Evelyn had spent years navigating these halls, mastering the delicate art of blending in and listening. Today, though, the whispers carried a weight that made her stomach tighten. Her instincts had led her to Gordon Warren, a senior aide with a reputation for knowing too much. He was a fixture in these halls, his sharp suits and sharper tongue often cutting through the air like a scalpel. Evelyn had managed to secure a meeting with him at an unassuming pie shop off Parliament Street. The shop was a far cry from the elegance of Whitehall. Its wooden booths and scuffed floors exuded a kind of charm that belied the heavy conversation it would soon host. Evelyn spotted Gordon seated in the corner, his posture relaxed but his eyes scanning the room like a predator assessing its territory. "Evelyn Harris," he greeted, his voice smooth yet wary. "Always digging." "And you're always dodging," she replied, sliding into the booth opposite him. The smell of warm pastry filled the air, but Evelyn's appetite was drowned by the tension crackling between them. She wasted no time. "Gordon, the Truss transformation. It's more than just policy. What aren't they telling us?" He leaned back, his expression carefully neutral. "You're barking up a very tall tree, Evelyn. Some branches don't bend, they break." "I'll have take my chances," she said, her voice steady. "You've seen the cracks in the foundation. I know you have." For a moment, Gordon's facade faltered. He glanced around the shop, ensuring they weren't overheard. "Let's just say this. The transformation is a stage, and the actors aren't all from Westminster. Some loyalties are bought, and some truths are better left buried." Evelyn's pen hovered over her notebook. "Who's pulling the strings?" He hesitated, the pause heavy with implications. "Look for the money," he said finally. "It always leads you to the source. But tread lightly, Evelyn. Not everyone plays by the rules you're used to." As Gordon left, his warning echoed in her mind. She sat in the booth for a moment longer, staring at her half-drunk cup of tea. The world outside the shop seemed suddenly sharper, more vivid, as if the edges of reality had been pulled into focus. She had a lead now, a dangerous, tantalizing thread to follow. Chapter 3. The Catalyst. The steady drizzle of rain greeted Evelyn as she stepped out of the pie shop, her mind a cacophony of thoughts. She pulled her coat tighter around her as she walked through the bustling streets of London, her boots splashing against the wet pavement. The city felt different today, its usual hum of activity underscored by an almost palpable tension. Her office, a cluttered sanctuary of chaos, was waiting. The walls were lined with bookshelves groaning under the weight of years of research, and her desk was an explosion of papers, files, and empty coffee mugs. She sank into her chair and stared at the blinking cursor on her laptop. Her notes from the day felt like pieces of a puzzle with no clear image to guide her. The sharp trill of her phone jolted her from her thoughts. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, and her first instinct was to let it ring. But something compelled her to answer. "Evelyn Harris," she said, her voice guarded. "Miss Harris," the voice on the other end drawled, smooth and deliberate. "I hear you've been asking questions. Dangerous ones." Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "Call me Aegis," the voice replied, a hint of amusement threading through the syllables. "I believe we have mutual interests. Perhaps we should meet." The line went dead before she could respond. Evelyn stared at the phone, her heart pounding. The name Aegis lingered in her mind, its meaning layered and unsettling. She'd encountered it before, always in whispers, always in contexts that suggested immense power and influence. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. She was no stranger to intimidation tactics, but this felt different. Aegis wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. The question was, to what? Chapter 4. The Shadow Network. Evelyn spent the next 3 days immersing herself in the fragmented pieces of the puzzle. Her investigations led her deep into the digital corridors of power and back to her trusted network of sources. Calls were made, encrypted messages exchanged, and favors called in. Each clue revealed fragments of a larger, more insidious picture. The name Aegis cropped up repeatedly, though never explicitly. It hovered on the edges of conversations and documents, a ghost that refused to fully materialize. Evelyn's inquiries painted a picture of a network operating in the shadows, an intricate web of influence stretching across governments, corporations, and private entities. These players were bound by shared interests, their actions orchestrating chaos to achieve unseen goals. Her search led her to Daniel McAllister, a tech billionaire whose influence seemed to permeate every corner of the financial and political landscape. Known for his charismatic speeches on innovation and progress, Daniel had become a figurehead of the new digital economy championed by Truss's policies. Evelyn's instincts told her he was more than just a beneficiary of the transformation. He was a key player. The invitation to a private fintech gala arrived in her inbox, addressed to her with surprising formality. The event was an exclusive affair, where politicians, corporate executives, and media influencers mingled under the guise of promoting innovation. Evelyn knew it was her best chance to confront McAllister. The gala was held in a gleaming skyscraper overlooking the Thames. The venue exuded opulence, with its glass walls offering a panoramic view of London's glittering skyline. Evelyn arrived in a simple black dress, her notebook discreetly tucked into her clutch. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her journalistic eye catching snippets of conversation that hinted at backroom deals and unspoken alliances. Daniel McAllister was the star of the evening, his presence commanding attention even in a room full of power players. He took the stage with effortless charisma, delivering a speech on the inevitability of digital currencies and the economic shift heralded by Truss's policies. His words were polished, his tone measured, but Evelyn detected an undercurrent of calculation. He wasn't just promoting innovation, he was selling a vision of a future shaped by the few who controlled the levers of power. When the applause died down, Evelyn seized her moment. She approached him during the networking session, weaving through the crowd until she stood before him. "Mr. McAllister," she said, extending a hand with a practiced smile. "Evelyn Harris, journalist." Daniel's sharp eyes met hers, and a faint smile curved his lips. "Ah, Miss Harris, I've read your work. Provocative." "I aim for more than provocation," she replied. "I'd like to discuss your views on the Truss transformation, particularly its implications for the digital economy." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the room. Let's talk. They settled into a secluded alcove, the hum of the gala fading into the background. Evelyn wasted no time. You've positioned yourself as a leader in this new economy, she began. But transformations of this scale often involve more than just public policy. Who benefits most from the chaos? Daniel's smile didn't waver, but his gaze sharpened. Chaos is merely a canvas, Miss Harris. For those with vision, it's an opportunity to paint something extraordinary. And Aegis, she pressed, where do they fit into this canvas? For the briefest moment, his composure faltered. His eyes flickered with something, surprise perhaps, or recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by a practiced calm. Be careful with the names you mention, he said, his tone low and measured. Aegis is a myth to some, a guardian to others, but myths have a way of consuming those who chase them. Evelyn held his gaze, unflinching. I'm not chasing myths, I'm chasing the truth. Daniel's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. Truth, Miss Harris, is a matter of perspective. Good luck finding yours. He rose, signaling the end of their conversation, and disappeared into the crowd. Evelyn remained seated, her mind racing. His reaction had confirmed her suspicions. Aegis was real, and their influence ran deeper than she'd imagined. As she left the gala, the night air biting against her skin, Evelyn felt the weight of her discoveries settling on her shoulders. The threads she was unraveling were leading her into dangerous territory, but she couldn't turn back now. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of secrecy and deception, and she would stop at nothing to uncover it. Chapter 5. The Unearthed Truth. The email arrived in Evelyn's inbox late at night, the sender marked only as anonymous. Its subject line read, "For your eyes only." Her heart skipped a beat as she clicked it open. Inside was a single attachment, a heavily encrypted dossier, and a brief message. The truth you seek is here. Be careful. They're watching. Evelyn's pulse quickened. This wasn't the first time she'd received anonymous tips, but this felt different. The attachment's encryption hinted at something far more significant than the usual leaked memos or insider grumbles. She would need help to crack it, and there was only one person she trusted for this level of technical expertise. Julian Tran's cottage was an oasis of isolation in the Norfolk countryside, surrounded by endless fields and the occasional bleating of sheep. The cryptographer had retreated to this rural haven years ago, trading his high-profile career in cybersecurity for the quiet life of an academic. Evelyn had to convince him to step out of retirement. Julian greeted her with a raised eyebrow and a mug of steaming coffee. His cluttered study was a testament to his brilliance, with stacks of books on cryptography and a desk covered in circuit boards, laptops and wires. I figured you'd show up with something impossible, Julian said, waving her toward a chair. You never call unless you need me to crack the uncrackable. Evelyn handed him a USB drive containing the dossier. This might be the most important file I've ever received. Julian plugged the drive into his computer, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the encrypted contents. Whoever created this wasn't messing around. Military-grade encryption, multiple layers. It's going to take time. I have time, Evelyn replied, though she knew it wasn't true. Each passing moment felt like a ticking clock, counting down to an inevitable discovery by those who wanted the dossier buried. For hours they worked in tense silence. Julian's fingers danced over the keyboard, occasionally pausing to reference one of his books or adjust a piece of hardware. Evelyn watched, her anxiety mounting with each passing minute. Finally, as the first rays of dawn broke through the window, Julian leaned back in his chair. Got it. The screen filled with documents, spreadsheets, and email chains. Evelyn's eyes widened as she took in the sheer scope of the information. The dossier was a meticulous account of backdoor deals, offshore accounts, and covert operations, all linked to the Truss transformation. At its center was Aegis, orchestrating every move with ruthless precision. This is massive, Julian said, his voice heavy with disbelief. These aren't just policy decisions. They're manipulating entire markets, destabilizing governments, and it's all tied to Aegis. Evelyn's hands trembled as she scrolled through the files. Names she recognized. Politicians, corporate executives, and even foreign operatives were all implicated. The dossier detailed secret meetings, financial transactions, and plans to exploit the chaos created by Truss's policies for personal gain. This isn't just corruption, Evelyn murmured. This is a blueprint for power consolidation on a global scale. Julian looked at her, his usual calm replaced by concern. Evelyn, you realize what this means, don't you? If you publish this, you'll be putting yourself in their crosshairs. She nodded, her resolve hardening. The public deserves to know the truth, no matter the cost. Evelyn returned to London with the dossier, her mind racing with the implications. She spent the next several days verifying the information, cross-referencing the names and events against her own research. Every piece of the puzzle fit, and the picture it painted was chilling. But with the truth came a new sense of danger. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. An unfamiliar car parked on her street, a shadow lingering too long outside her office. Aegis wouldn't take kindly to being exposed, and she knew they had the means to silence her if they chose. Still, Evelyn pressed on. The dossier was more than just a collection of facts. It was a weapon, one that could dismantle the facade of the Truss transformation and expose the forces pulling the strings. She just needed to decide how and when to use it. Chapter 6. A Dangerous Choice. Evelyn sat at her desk, the glow of her laptop casting long shadows across the dimly lit room. The encrypted dossier lay decrypted and fully dissected before her. A Pandora's box of secrets that could upend governments, cripple corporations, and send shockwaves through the corridors of power. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, poised to start drafting her exposé, but hesitation rooted her in place. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with another anonymous call. She stared at it for a moment before answering, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Evelyn Harris. The voice on the other end was smooth, calculated. "You're in possession of something dangerous." "Aegis," Evelyn said, the name slipping from her lips like a challenge. There was a pause, and then the voice replied, colder now. "Names have power, Miss Harris. You should be careful how you wield them. The dossier you've acquired, what do you hope to achieve by releasing it? Do you really believe the truth will set anyone free, or is this just about your own ambitions?" Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. "This isn't about me. It's about the people being deceived, manipulated, and exploited." "Do you think they'll thank you?" the voice retorted. "The truth you're so eager to expose could destabilize everything. Markets, governments, society itself. Is that a burden you're prepared to bear?" Evelyn's silence spoke volumes. The voice softened, almost conciliatory. "You're at a crossroads, Miss Harris. There's a way to resolve this quietly, without chaos. Hand over the dossier, and we'll ensure you're left alone. No harm, no fallout." "Left alone?" Evelyn repeated, her voice edged with incredulity. "You've been watching me, threatening me, and now you want me to trust you?" "We're offering you a way out," the voice replied. "Consider the alternative." The line went dead, leaving Evelyn alone in the silence of her apartment. The weight of their words lingered, but so did her conviction. She couldn't ignore the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. The threats only escalated in the following days. A car followed her through London's streets. Her office was broken into, though nothing seemed to be taken. And then there was the package, a small box left on her doorstep. Inside was a single bullet, nestled in black velvet. Evelyn stared at it, her pulse pounding in her ears. This wasn't a warning, it was a promise. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. Fear was their weapon, and she refused to let it paralyze her. Instead, she doubled down. She began encrypting her files, creating backups stored in secure locations. She reached out to trusted colleagues, sharing parts of the dossier with instructions to publish if anything happened to her. If Aegis wanted to silence her, they would have to contend with a network of journalists ready to pick up where she left off. Late one night, as Evelyn pored over the final draft of her exposé, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message. "You've been warned. This is your last chance." Evelyn stared at the words, her resolve hardening. She knew the risks, but she also knew she couldn't turn back. The truth was too important, too powerful to suppress, and if she didn't have the courage to expose it, who would? She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. Tomorrow, the world would change. She didn't know what the fallout would be, but she knew she had to see it through. Chapter 7. The Breaking Point. The newsroom buzzed with an intensity Evelyn hadn't seen in years. Phones rang off the hook, editors barked orders, and reporters scrambled to cover the rapidly unfolding story. At the center of it all sat Evelyn, her laptop open to the completed exposé, the shadow network, the truth behind the Truss transformation. Every detail was meticulously laid out: names, dates, transactions, and the damning evidence of Aegis's orchestrated chaos. Evelyn had worked tirelessly to ensure every claim was substantiated, her words sharpened like weapons against the layers of deceit she'd uncovered. Now it was time to release them into the world. Her editor, Martin Collins, stood behind her, his brow furrowed as he reviewed the final draft. "This is a bombshell, Evelyn," he said, his voice a mix of admiration and trepidation. "Are you ready for what happens next?" Evelyn nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she hit send. The story was live. Within moments, the newsroom's monitors lit up with notifications, emails pouring in, social media ablaze, and other news outlets picking up the story. The dossier's secrets were no longer confined to her laptop. They belonged to the world now. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Protests erupted across the UK, from London's Trafalgar Square to smaller towns and cities. Crowds chanted slogans demanding accountability, their voices rising in a collective roar against the corruption that had been exposed. News anchors dissected the story in real time, their faces a mix of shock and outrage. Politicians scrambled to issue statements, some denying any involvement, while others called for immediate investigations. The global implications were staggering, with markets reacting violently to the revelations. The pound plummeted, and financial institutions braced for chaos. Evelyn watched the coverage from her office, her emotions a swirling mix of pride and fear. She had done what she set out to do, revealed the truth, but the fallout was more explosive than she could have anticipated. Her phone buzzed constantly, messages flooding in from colleagues, friends, and strangers. Some praised her courage, while others hurled threats and insults. The scale of the response was overwhelming, but Evelyn refused to let it shake her resolve. Meanwhile, in Westminster, the Truss government teetered on the brink of collapse. Key members of the cabinet resigned in disgrace, their names linked to the dossier's revelations. Liz Truss herself appeared on live television, her once steely demeanor now visibly strained. "These allegations are deeply concerning," she said, her voice measured but brittle. "I have ordered a full inquiry into the matters raised. Let me be clear, I will not allow the actions of a few to undermine the integrity of this government." The statement did little to quell the public's anger. If anything, it fueled it further. Evelyn's exposé had torn away the veneer of stability, exposing a rot that could no longer be ignored. That night, as Evelyn walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The streets were quieter than usual, the city seemingly holding its breath. She turned a corner and stopped in her tracks. A man in a dark coat stood under a street lamp, his face obscured by shadow. "You've made powerful enemies," he said, his voice low and even. "They won't let this go." Evelyn squared her shoulders, her voice steady despite the fear prickling at the edges of her mind. The truth was worth it. The man regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "Let's hope it is." He disappeared into the night, leaving Evelyn alone with the weight of his words. Back in her apartment, Evelyn sank into her chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her. She stared at the blinking cursor on her laptop, the empty page waiting for her next story. Despite everything, the threats, the fear, the chaos, she felt a strange sense of calm. The truth was out there now, a ripple turning into a tidal wave. And though the fight was far from over, Evelyn knew she had done what was right. The cost had been high, but so was the reward, a chance for accountability, for change, and for a future where power could no longer hide in the shadows. Chapter 8: The Path Forward. Weeks had passed since the publication of Evelyn's exposé, but the reverberations continued to shake the United Kingdom and beyond. The initial storm of outrage had given way to a period of reckoning, as inquiries, resignations, and protests reshaped the nation's political landscape. Evelyn sat at her favorite cafe near the Thames, nursing a cup of black coffee. The chatter of patrons around her was a welcome contrast to the intensity she'd lived through recently. Her gaze drifted to the headlines of a nearby newspaper: Aegis Network under investigation, Parliament to hold emergency session. The dossier's impact had been monumental. Public pressure forced the government to initiate sweeping reforms, including transparency measures and investigations into corporate influence. Several key figures named in the dossier had been arrested, their faces plastered across every major media outlet. The fall of these once untouchable power players felt like a victory, but Evelyn couldn't ignore the cost. Her own life had changed irrevocably. The threats against her had diminished but not disappeared. She now lived under constant surveillance, her every move monitored by private security hired by her employer. Her once solitary walks through London had become calculated routes with one eye over her shoulder. Still, she refused to let fear dictate her life. Martin Collins, her editor, joined her at the cafe, a rare smile softening his usually stern features. "You've done something extraordinary, Evelyn," he said, sliding into the chair opposite her. "This story, it's going to define your career." Evelyn shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Careers are easy to define. Lives are harder. I've spent mine chasing the truth, but this was something else." Martin nodded, his expression growing serious. "There's still more to uncover, you know. Aegis isn't going to disappear quietly. They'll adapt, regroup, and find new ways to operate." "I know," Evelyn replied, her gaze steady. "But at least now, people are watching. They know the name. They know the stakes." Martin sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "What about you? Are you ready for what comes next?" Evelyn's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I've been ready my whole life." The protests outside Parliament had become a daily occurrence, a symbol of the public's newfound demand for accountability. Evelyn attended one such protest, blending into the crowd as she listened to the speaker's call for systemic change. The energy was electric, a palpable force of collective determination. A young woman approached her, holding a handwritten sign that read, "Truth Matters." "You're Evelyn Harris, aren't you?" the woman asked, her voice tinged with awe. Evelyn nodded. "That's me." The woman extended her hand. "Thank you for what you've done. People like me, we needed to know." Evelyn shook her hand, warmth spreading through her chest. Moments like these reminded her why she'd taken the risk. The truth wasn't just an abstract ideal. It was a lifeline for those who had been left in the dark for too long. As the weeks turned into months, Evelyn found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The Truss transformation, the whispers in Whitehall, the enigmatic figure of Aegis, it had all felt like a labyrinth designed to trap her. But she had navigated it, not unscathed, but unbroken. The world was still far from perfect. Aegis's influence, though diminished, hadn't been eradicated. The cracks in the system were still visible, and the fight for transparency and accountability was far from over. Yet there was hope. Hope that the truth, once revealed, could inspire change. Evelyn returned to her desk one quiet evening, her laptop waiting like an old friend. She opened a blank document and began typing the first lines of her next story. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. As her fingers moved across the keyboard, a faint smile played on her lips. Evelyn Harris, the relentless seeker of truth, was far from finished. The end.